Our next speaker, Rachel Ayrton. She is an early career fellow, Institute for Research into Super Diversity, University of Birmingham. And she is going to tackle a very important issue. I know something about Sudanese in America, some Sudanese in Norway, but in the United Kingdom, the diaspora is such a large diaspora. It's very interesting to hear your research and reflection on the identity among the diaspora. So I give you the thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think it's really interesting that my presentation has been put alongside Rita's, because Rita's is very much looking at what's going up, kind of really at the hub of what's happening in South Sudan governmentally. And my research is coming from the opposite direction, from looking at the grassroots, from looking at the everyday lives of people who are living at the margins in some senses, certainly geographically in diaspora. So good morning and thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to be here. I'll be speaking to you today from my ongoing research on national identity and belonging among the South Sudanese diaspora in the UK. But first, for a bit of context, since some of us haven't met before, I just wanted to tell you a bit about my background, because it'd be obvious to those in the room, if not those online, that I'm not South Sudanese myself. So I just want to give a little bit of background on where I come from in this. So I began my career in community development work before doing my PhD at Southampton University. My training's in sociology and social research methods. From 2019 until August, I had a postdoctoral fellowship to study national identity and belonging with the South Sudanese Diaspora in the UK. And that's the work that I'm presenting from today. Just a month ago, I started a new job at Birmingham with a fellowship from the Leverhulme Trust. And for the next 5 years, I'll be looking at practices that bring people together as acts of everyday peace building. But I'll tell you about that a bit later. The most important thing for now is to say that the way that I work is participatory. I'm working with a research advisory group made up of people from within the South Sudanese community in the UK. Since I'm not myself part of this community, I feel it's very important that the way that I work is collaborative. And I'm more grateful than I can say to those people for working with me. So in this presentation, I'll begin by looking briefly at three important theoretical questions. What is identity? Why does identity matter? And how can we study national identity? I will then describe the design of the study before outlining some preliminary findings, some possible implications, and giving you a sense of where we're going next with this research. So turning to our first theoretical question, what is identity? In academic theories, there are two main approaches to identity. One suggests that it is natural to us, we're born with it, and it's part of who we are. This also suggests that it's unchangeable. The second approach suggests that identities are socially constructed. They are chosen to a degree, or at least people make choices about how they weigh their various identities against each other. This perspective also suggests that social identities are malleable. They can be changed. The first account of identity is known as essentialism, and the second we can call constructionism. I argue that while we often experience identities as natural, as per the essentialist view, they are in fact socially constructed. The cultural theorist Stuart Hall has observed how ethnic, racial, and national cultural identities are often described in essentialist terms, as an unchanging core of the self, as part of who we are. He argues instead that identity is not an essence, it's a positioning. As he puts it, it's not who we are or where we come from, so much as what we might become. From this point of view, identities don't pre-exist, they're narrated. That is, they're stories that are told. That doesn't make them any less real. As Hall puts it, being socially constructed does not make identities a mere trick of the imagination. They have powerful real-world consequences. Importantly, social identities must incorporate both similarities and differences. They have to tell us what the important similarities are that enable us to share an identity with others, whilst making sense of the inevitable differences between people who share that identity. So why does identity matter? Well, again, Stuart Hall has observed that the construction of social identity is an act of power. Identities matter because if they are socially constructed, this suggests that some people have particular influence over the boundaries of identities, that is, who is in and who is out, and also how particular groupings of people are relatively included or excluded within these boundaries. Neri Yuval Davis calls this the politics of belonging. In other words, sameness and difference can be manipulated to serve political ends. The politics of belonging are particularly pertinent for those of us who identify as diaspora, as this position is one that is in a grey zone between different definitions of insider and outsider, as Nando Sigona and colleagues have observed. How then can we study national identity? I've suggested that identities are made up of narratives. Therefore, in order to investigate national identity, we need to look at national narratives. In this case, the way people talk about what it means to be South Sudanese. I understand nations as imagined communities. This comes from the influential work of Benedict Anderson, and he uses the term imagined communities to describe the way that a group of people can share a sense of connection, solidarity, and togetherness, even though they might never have met the majority of others that they share this connection with. A national culture is created by the nation's narratives, which Frantz Fanon described as the whole body of efforts made by a people in the sphere of thought to describe, justify, and praise the action through which that people has created itself and keeps itself in existence. The purpose of the national narrative is to maintain the boundaries between us and them, while also creating sufficient space for the differences that exist between people within the nation. Michael Bainham has described how through narratives, identities are both brought along and brought about. They're brought along by people as the stories that we receive and tell about ourselves become routine and sedimented, like the buildup of deposits by a river, so they feel fixed and stable. They're brought about as when people enter into conversation with these identities, they create a joint narrative, which might draw on the narratives they bring along, but which is also more than the sum of its parts. Now, that's quite enough theory for us to be getting on with. Let's take a brief historical look at South Sudan through the lens of national identity. In a 2006 piece entitled Sudan, a Nation in Turbulent Search of Itself, Francis Deng described the Sudanese civil wars as an acute crisis of national identity. He pointed to how the diverse racial, ethnic, cultural, and religious identities of the country's people affected the way things were distributed. Things like power, wealth, services, development, and all the rights of citizenship. When the South achieved its independence, Abraham Awalich evaluated that there was a fledgling national identity in South Sudan, based on the common struggle for recognition, dignity, and equal rights. He and other commentators urged for nation building to be a priority in order to create a shared sense of identity and national unity, much along the lines of what David shared with us earlier, and to avert the risk of a new civil war within the state. Some speculated that remembrance of the liberation struggle or language or Christian heritage could form the basis for national identity. However, the civil war that started in 2013 and the chronic violence that has continued ever since has put a stop to nation building and ensured that fledgling national identity, injured that fledgling national identity that Abraham spoke of. In this context, my sociological study has focused on the South Sudanese diaspora in the UK, an identity position that, as we have seen, sits in this grey, depending on how insider and outsider are defined by those with the power to do so. The research question that I've been working with the Research Advisory Group to answer is this: how do South Sudanese people living in the UK narrate and negotiate their national identity? The most important thing to say about the methodology of the study, as I've said already, is that it's collaborative, it's participatory. I couldn't have achieved this alone, and the Research Advisory Group members have been instrumental in the research design, in recruiting participants, in planning how to disseminate findings of the research, and all aspects of management and governance of the project. The study takes a qualitative approach. That means the focus is on creating in-depth data based on people's lived experiences and their reflections on them. The number of participants in a qualitative study is not always very large, although it's still important to have a clear sampling strategy to ensure that the study is representative. The goal is to achieve depth rather than breadth. We organised focus group discussions. These are usually small group discussions with between 4 and 10 participants. Ours had between 3 and 8 participants in practice. Focus groups are a really good method for understanding group identities because people have to negotiate their meanings together. We held 8 focus group discussions in major urban centres in the UK in 2016, 2021 and 2022. There were separate groups for first and second generation South Sudanese, although since I'm in the early stages of my analysis, I'm not ready to draw comparisons between the generations. Among the first generation, the groups were separated by gender, but in all groups, we tried to include a mix of ethnicities to enable this process of negotiation to take place within the discussion. I also conducted 11 one-to-one interviews in the early stages of the project to provide some context for the study. The focus groups used photo elicitation. That means that I shared photographs for people to respond to and discuss. These photographs were taken in South Sudan during the campaigning before the referendum. And here are some examples of the images that we looked at. I collected 21 images online and shared them as I thought they captured some interesting messages about what separation and being South Sudanese rather than Sudanese meant to people at the time. As I said earlier, in a qualitative study, the depth of data is more important than a simple number of participants. However, representation is important. As you can see from these tables, we had 51 participants overall, with roughly an equal split between men and women. I've also given an indication of the ethnic groups represented in the interviews and focus group discussions. Obviously, in a qualitative study of this scale, it would not be possible to ensure that all the 64 tribes of South Sudan were represented in the study. But we can see that the largest ethnic groups were included, as well as several smaller or minority tribes. We can also see that the 3 historic regions of Equatoria, Upper Nile and Paraxal were represented ethnically, so there is evidence of diversity within the data set. So let's move on now to the findings of this research based on the analysis so far. It's important to state that all participants chose pseudonyms, so they cannot be personally identified. Beginning with the politics of belonging, you'll remember that this is about how the boundaries of who is included and excluded in the nation are drawn, who has the power to draw these boundaries, and for what purpose. In this extract, Amos describes the social exclusion of Western diasporas within the nation. He describes a pecking order or class system that has emerged, where at the top or in the centre are those who served in the SPLA to the very end. Then come those who served at any time, then those who suffered inside South Sudan. Then comes the East African diaspora, and last of all, the Western diaspora. In his words, the last people at the bottom, because people say you ran away, neither did you join the war front, nor did you stay under the bombs when we were being shelled or starved or whatever. We can see from this that the Western diasporas are alienated through selective remembering of their significant contributions to the war effort, such as sending funds and political lobbying, and the assumption that they did not suffer. They're marginalised in the national narrative on this basis, so we can see that belonging is not evenly distributed within the nation. Going further, some individuals are not in diaspora out of choice, but have been expelled or are unsafe to return to South Sudan. In these cases, you might even argue that the political project of belonging in action is seeking to push them outside of the boundaries of the nation altogether. Next, we'll look at this national narrative, the images and experiences that people draw on to describe a shared identity. In this section, I focus on the way participants responded to the photographs together. Although there were detailed commentaries on individual photographs, some of which we will come to, overwhelmingly the set of 21 photographs was taken as a collective, representative of participants' long-held hopes and the imagined community of South Sudan. As one participant said, looking at the photos together, that is when we were dreaming. Others also shared that that was their dream. South Sudan was viewed as the promised land where the wrongs of the past would be redressed. High among these expectations was to see an end to slavery, marginalisation and exploitation, which is represented in these images, conveying that South Sudan would no longer be the backyard of Sudan, and that South Sudanese would be first-class citizens in their own country. Here we can see how one participant expanded on the metaphor of being the backyard of Sudan. She draws a distinction between the house, which you make clean for when visitors come, and the backyard where you put dirty stuff or unwanted stuff. She describes Sudan Khartoum as the face Sudan presented to the outside world. Development happened, while in the south, there was nothing there. She says that South Sudanese felt that the regime in northern Sudan had done nothing for them, and although they were technically part of Sudan, there was no interest in them as actual people. In this discussion, and in others where this image was singled out by participants, they went on to describe that this is how they feel they are now being treated in South Sudan. They are once again second-class citizens who feel like they don't belong. Participants gave graphic, physical descriptions of how this affects them, feeling nausea or pain. This next image caused the most controversy in the discussions because of what the imagery of the flag and the cow have come to mean since 2013 in terms of who is included and who is excluded in the nation. Here, Al-Shahi describes the cow in the picture as the real South Sudanese. He says, the cow, even my experience in my own homeland, is worth more than me. Its life worth more than my life. So it's supposed to be a blessing to the nation. But for me, where I'm coming from, my homeland, it's a curse. He goes on to describe how people and their livelihoods are being displaced for cattle, and their houses are turned into barns. Because of what the cow means in terms of his own place within the nation, Al-Shahi says even the sight of beef meat makes him feel sick. Although participants drew a lot of parallels between their current experiences and the oppression they experienced as part of Sudan, they describe the current conflict as being worse on 3 fronts. Firstly, they say this is what we are doing to ourselves. In the Sudanese civil war, or at least the national narrative remembers it, there was a clear us and them. The enemy was Sudan, the north. They were the oppressor and the southerners were the oppressed. This gave a very clear narrative of who was included in the nation of South Sudan and who was the outside other against which the nation was defined. The current conflict is multi-sided and complex, but there is no outside enemy. According to Benedict Anderson, it's the sense of solidarity and connection with co-nationals, the image of communion with others, as he puts it, that they have never met, which makes the imagined community of a nation. There's no hiding from the fact that South Sudanese people are both the perpetrators and the victims of violence and oppression in the current conflict, which causes a rupture in this imagined connection, with co-nationals. Secondly, the post-2013 conflict is worse in terms of the nature of the violence. People say, you have never seen these things before, even in the wars with the North. People report worse atrocities have taken place. Finally, it is worse in terms of the trauma that's experienced at a distance, particularly due to the immediacy of communication technologies, social media, and the proliferation of photographs. One woman described how her first thought when she wakes up in the morning is what she will see when she picks up her phone. Many participants describe their own sense of national identity in essentialized terms, that it's something inescapable, it's simply who they are. This means that their sense of selfhood, who they are, is tied up with what they associate with being South Sudanese. Academic studies on the role of emotions in national belonging tend to focus on pride and shame. And it's important to note here that these experiences are not mutually exclusive. It's possible to simultaneously feel proud and ashamed. I think any of us who are parents know that to be true. There were 2 particular contexts in which a sense of pride shone through in the data. The first was to do with experiences of solidarity with other South Sudanese people in settings where they were in the minority. Of course, many people who identify as South Sudanese spent time living in the north of Sudan, and there were numerous stories of South Sudanese supporting each other, of togetherness and kinship in this context, against the backdrop of being marginalised as a southerner. People talked about playing together in sports team and the bonds formed as peers in education. People spoke of support from the community to provide or complete education where state support was lacking, or even strangers sticking up for another South Sudanese person's rights when they were being threatened. In the UK, one of the second generation told the story of a South Sudanese person arriving in a new city to start a degree course and being stopped in the street by a South Sudanese stranger who invited them into their home. The other context, of course, was the referendum and independence. Many groups shared stories of their experiences of voting, the lengths that they went to get there to register and vote despite inclement weather. The hospitality of South Sudanese people in London was a big feature, providing accommodation, stepping aside to let those who had travelled far vote first, providing food, and so on. The way everyone contributed to ensuring that the referendum was beyond reproach by respecting procedures also came through. The way you could hear a pin drop in the room during the vote counting and the announcement of the results. And of course, the way people came together to celebrate independence. To me, it's noticeable how hospitality is a feature that runs through these proud associations with being South Sudanese. For some participants, however, their experiences of conflict since independence has fundamentally transformed their national narratives in ways that leave them feeling ashamed. Some participants talked about how hard it is to explain what is happening in South Sudan to others in multicultural Britain, and even how they do not like to own up to being South Sudanese when people ask where they're from. This feeling is movingly articulated by Savannah. She says, "That's the story of my identity. When we say our identity, all we think of is trouble, pain, and sorrow, needing to help." She reports that the jubilation and joy that was there at independence now is not there. For her, South Sudanese identity is shrouded in pain, in death, and in desperation. She says it's something that you don't really want to look at. In other words, she experiences it as a source of shame. At this point, I'd like to draw an interim conclusion to the analysis so far, that the dilemma of national identity for the South Sudanese diaspora in the UK is about a mismatch between the national narrative they hold to and their experiences as citizens of South Sudan, between the dream and the reality so far. For the South Sudanese people living in the UK who took part in my study, many of the messages represented in the photographs from 2010-2011 remain a summary of their aspirations. They still want justice, freedom, peace, development, to be first-class citizens in their own country. It's worth noting that these aspects of the national narrative rely on the state to fulfil them, which is an issue I will return to at the end. Nevertheless, there is a contradiction between the national aspirations that people held or hold and their experiences for the past 9 years. This is in itself a source of trauma and leaves people in an ambivalent position in relation to their South Sudanese identity. Most still feel proud of Sudanese to some extent, but to varying degrees, this pride has been displaced by an element of shame. This is a rupture that people need to manage. They need to develop coping strategies that enable them to live with this tension. I'll turn to some of these strategies that I've seen in the data now. I'm not judging between these strategies. They're all understandable and reasonable responses in light of what people are experiencing. Something I want to continue to consider as I continue this analysis is what the possible outcomes of these strategies might be. Might they lead to reinforcing divisions, or might they engender a culture of peace? I've distilled 5 responses or coping strategies in light of the tension between national narrative and experience that I've outlined. The first is avoidance. Participants lamented that social occasions such as weddings, funerals, christenings, and so on used to be frequent and well attended. Members of the second generation recalled as children being together constantly. For example, Flo said, hall parties, yeah, listen, when we were younger, every weekend we had something to wear. It's like there was a party or celebration, a christening. And some interview participants talked about how they avoid social occasions now because it's too difficult being together. When we were recruiting people to take part in this study, some who were invited to focus group discussions declined because they didn't want to talk about politics or matters to do with South Sudan. One participant commented on how COVID-19 has contributed to this, as people have had the excuse to stay apart and have lost the routines of interaction with each other. The second strategy is despair. Some people experience the suffering in South Sudan through the way they identify with their people, as well as the suffering that they have personally experienced through ways they've been affected. Some find themselves unable to see a way forward from the current circumstances. They reflect, as we've seen, on the war being worse than the conflict with the North. And on that basis, it was not uncommon for people in discussions to share that they wished they hadn't voted for separation. Thirdly, some people manage the tension through taking a historical or developmental view, which sees the present circumstances as a continuation of the struggle. From this perspective, South Sudan is going through the hard process that all nations go through on the way to peace and security. People would often draw a parallel with the conflicts in Europe. John Wani sums this up well here. Despite his disappointment at everything that has happened, he sees the current failures of South Sudan as part of its development. It's like a child born, he says, part of learning how to walk. They will keep falling, but the child doesn't give up. The child will they will fall and maybe get themselves injured. He expresses the hope that, in his words, as long as there are people who are determined to do the right thing, that struggle needs to continue to be able to fix what has gone wrong. We have to learn from the lessons that have happened. The fourth strategy I noticed was about redrawing the boundaries of the nation, the definition of who is inside and who is outside, either informally or formally. Informally, participants reported that within South Sudan, people tend towards identifying at smaller. At independence, people would identify as South Sudanese. After 2013, they would identify by ethnic group. Now people identify by subgroups within their tribes. Semi-formally, if you like, some participants advocated for federalism as a political strategy to give increasing autonomy to groups according to regions. This, if you like, draws some dotted lines within the boundaries of the nation, or perhaps makes some distinctions between nations within the state, depending on how it would be implemented. The formal version of retracting national boundaries is separatism. Politically, this could be seeking formal independence for certain groups. In terms of everyday practices, this might be represented by keeping social mixing within regional or ethnic groups. The final strategy I observed is selective disidentification with co-nationals. In other words, the idea that the integrity of the nation can be restored if selected individuals cease to exert influence over it. This usually involved drawing a distinction between a corrupt elite and the majority of South Sudanese citizens in one way or another. It often came out by recognizing that people from ethnic groups who are usually considered to be dominant are also suffering as much as anyone else. It was quite common for participants to single out leaders. If those who are replicating the patterns of oppression of the past were removed or transformed, the problem would be solved. In other words, this strategy involves putting in a divide between the state and the nation, saving the imagined community with co-nationals through rejecting the state as embodied by its present leadership. This could come about by various forms of justice, from the more restorative, such as leaders apologising and changing their ways, or by stepping aside, to the more punitive, such as individuals being removed or subject to war crimes proceedings. I'll now reflect on some of the implications of this study that I see so far and tell you a little about the direction we'll be taking our research in next. Yes. Yes. Let me just go through these implications and then I'll come to an end. Thank you. My first comment is that it's useful to view identities as constructed rather than as something that is innate, that we're born with. This enables us to perceive how identities are formed and articulated as an act of power. It also opens up the possibility of people having autonomy over what goes in their national narrative, rather than simply having it imposed on them. In other words, it creates space for agency or even for resistance. So what kinds of national narratives could be useful for diaspora communities seeking to create a counterculture which is conducive to peace? At the beginning of this presentation, I explained that national narratives manage sameness and difference in two ways, through inclusion or exclusion, and through accounting for diversity within the nation. From what I've seen, the North-South separation of Sudan gave a very clear narrative of who was in and who was out of the nation. As one of the banners in the photograph read, South is for Southerners only, independence is our option. However, the second aspect of making space for internal difference, for heterogeneity within the nation, has not been equally addressed. And this offers opportunities to shape a more inclusive national culture. In the data I presented, I observed that a lot of the things that South Sudanese people living in the UK diaspora wanted are the same things that they hoped for in the referendum. justice, freedom, peace, development, to be first-class citizens in their own country. And it struck me that these are all tied to the relationship between the state and its citizens. Insofar as the national narrative is tied to striving for these things, the people of the nation are at the mercy of the state, for better or worse. This led me to wonder, can members of civil society in diaspora articulate a national narrative that centres on co-nationals' ties to one another, rather than the government's duties to its citizens? I've spoken about the content of these narratives, but how they come about is also important. Although we use small group discussions as a data collection technique, participants reflected at the end of discussions on how helpful they had found taking part, even though it was a significant emotional effort for them to do so. I don't have time to go through the quotes I picked out on this in detail as I would like to, but I will just highlight that participants felt this gave an opportunity to air things that are unspoken, to get out the pain that's inside and to receive some respite, some relief and healing. To talk about experiences in an organic way that doesn't get embroiled in politics, and in a safe space where people can say things that need to be said, even if they're difficult, and to let the table that people sit around bear them, enabling people to move forward together. Finally, and I won't go into this now because of time, but I just wanted to flag that as myself and the Research Advisory Group have recently been given some further funding, which will give us 5 years to pursue a project called Conviviality as Relief and Resistance, Practices of Togetherness and Belonging among the South Sudanese in the UK. We designed this project together, and it will focus on the everyday practices that bring together across divisions, the things people actually do. And it will conceive of these practices as acts of resistance to the conflict and examples of grassroots peace building. My contact details are here. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rachel. This question of identity, not only in Sudan, South Sudan, but throughout the world, is becoming a problem politically. The question is that if one group or identity group imposes its will and control and authority over the other side, the problem. So can we have Richard?
Thank you, Ahmed. I'd like first to encourage the audience who are online to please submit any questions. You can write them into the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And if appropriate, if possible, I may be able to connect you so you can ask your question live. If anyone in the audience in the conference room has their hands up and would like to start off the questions, please do.
Because there are many.
Thank you very much. My name is Pascal. I'm from Ghana. Very well, good presentation by Rita and Rachel. This question goes to Rachel. Considering your very interesting background, what would you say were your study limitations? Thank you.
Thank you. The question was about the limitations of my study. I would say one of the key limitations is that as an early career postdoctoral researcher, I'm working, in terms of the institution I'm working from, I'm working alone. This is kind of a self-directed project. Having said that, as I've shared, I've been working with an advisory group from within the community, and they are invaluable partners in it. But that's nevertheless meant that progress on the project is not always smooth because of my own constraints and childcare and so on. And so I think the advisory group have expressed a great deal of patience in me. I think that's one limitation. I think all of us on the advisory group felt that we would have liked to have held more discussions and have more participants in each discussion. It was actually really, really difficult to recruit participants for this study. There are a number of reasons that we've identified in reflecting on the study within the advisory group why that might be the case. For me, the most pressing one is that it was a very big demand of people to ask them to come together and to talk about this. And it opened up wounds, it exposed things that are painful for them to speak of. And so I actually see those people that did attend to take part in the study, that doing so was really an act of patriotism. One participant even shared in the discussion how, he did it for South Sudan. He went because he believes in his country, and if he'll do anything that he feels can help. But there are others who weren't in an emotional place to be able to do that. People in the community we know are very heavily committed with working shifts, working multiple jobs, with caring commitments, with responsibilities in the community, both here and internationally. And so people's availability is also a challenge. So I think that's something we would have liked to. Having said that, as I'm analysing the data, I can say that it is extraordinarily deep data. And I think that there's a lot that can be said on the basis of it. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Rachel, a question from Joe Barnaba online asked, is there any scope in your project to research and provide recommendations on how to build and construct shared national identity?
Yeah, okay. Yes, I hope so. So I'm just writing down the question because it's really helpful for me to learn from the questions that are asked as I continue in the analysis. I think what I hope, as I said, I'm still in the process of analysing the data. That process hasn't complete yet. I'm hopeful that as I continue to work with the data, that I will be able to see some of the bases for national identity and belonging that are emerging within the data, which perhaps, as I indicated, aren't tied to what the government does or doesn't do. I suppose what I'm interested in is the agency that people have in diaspora communities, in the grassroots, in civil society, to shape their own identity and the direction that goes in. And so I'm interested in looking at what there is in the data to suggest grounds for a shared identity that kind of go beyond what is dependent on what the government provides. I mentioned hospitality. I think that's something that comes across in a lot of the stories and narratives. A sense of history, the shared struggle, being a people of struggle, I think is something that's come across very strongly. And so I will continue to kind of look for these themes that are coming through, which form part of an identity that can be shared kind of across the diverse peoples of South Sudan. Thank you for the question, Joe.
Thank you.